Working with VMM 2012 SP1 and HyperV v3 in Windows Server 2012. That's a lot of numbers and letters in that title. What are we talking about in this nugget? We are talking about specifically the SP1 upgrade for System Center. And I'm going to focus most of our attentions today on specifically the VMM parts of that SP1 upgrade. And then we're also talking about HyperV version 3, which is the HyperV that we get out of Windows Server 2012. Now, I'm consolidating these two because if you recall, go back 17 nuggets with me, or 18 nuggets. Remember how this series was sort of kicked off with the idea that, don't worry, we're going to focus on Server 2008 R2 for a lot of this. And then we'll move to the 2012 stuff a little bit later. But don't worry about it, because most of what we're talking about here has nothing to do with HyperV. I mean, everything relies on HyperV. But HyperV is kind of something that gets pushed into almost appliance status when we think about it here in relation with System Center. Well, in this nugget, we come full circle, because we started with the implementation of HyperV, and then we went through all the System Center stuff that we could do, put together to create our private cloud. And now here we are at the end talking about HyperV once again. The reason for it is because this Service Pack 1 update, this SP1 update with System Center, adds an incredible amount of new functionality to System Center 2012. Most importantly is support for Windows Server 2012 and also Windows 8. It also adds support for Windows Azure. In fact, in the next nugget, we'll talk about how you can connect up your app controller instance to Windows Azure so that you can manage your resources up there and deploy things out there that you first create here in your local VMM instance. Now, there's a whole lot more to System Center 2012 SP1. If you go to the TechNet website that discusses it, you're going to find page after page after page of new features. And I'll tell you, this is just between you and I. Honestly, if I were deploying System Center in production in my environment, I'd kind of want to do it on SP1. There are some little idiosyncrasies in the RTM version that get resolved in SP1, and just the new features really better align what you are looking for and what you want with what you're going to get. So right now today, the day of this filming is Halloween 2012, and we are actually on the SP1 beta. And that's why really we haven't deployed all of these services on Server 2012 up to this point. By the time you watch this, you're reviewing this series, we may have the full instance or the RTM bits for SP1. So if that's the time, get yourself up to SP1, because System Center just works better atop this new SP1 code. If you are doing an upgrade, though, the process, the order in which you go about upgrading your existing environment to SP1 has a very specific series of steps you have to go through. And the order has to be done in a very specific order, because there are prerequisites and a cascading series of prerequisites for all of these integrations that require them to be done in that specific order. The very first of these is SCO, or System Center Orchestrator, which some like to shorten to Scorch. System Center Orchestrator is the one you should really update first. It can support both the RTM and the SP1 integration packs side by side for the rest of System Center. So it kind of forms the foundation of all these integrations anyway. That having Orchestrator updated first, because it supports both of those, is just generally a good idea. After that is Service Manager. Service Manager is the second one, because the SP1 connectors that Service Manager uses are backwards compatible but not forwards compatible. So you want to do that next, because, well, you have that backwards compatibility. After that, or I guess in parallel with Service Manager, is going to be System Center Data Protection Manager. DPN can actually go before Service Manager, because there really isn't a direct link between Service Manager and DPM. But DPM has to go after Orchestrator because of that integration pack between DPM and Orchestrator. Okay, so you'll want to put this in place either directly after Service Manager or even potentially before Service Manager in that list. After that, then we have Ops Manager. Ops Manager goes next. The existing management pack for Orchestrator, Service Manager, DPM, these will work when the components are upgraded to SP1. So Ops Manager can be upgraded after these previous three pieces. Whereas Service Manager doesn't have forward, where Service Manager only has backward compatibility, Operations Manager actually has a bit of forward compatibility. But you do have to upgrade Ops before VMM, because there is some reestablishment of connections that need to occur after the Ops Manager upgrade. We haven't talked about Config Manager at all in this series, but if you're doing Config Manager, which a lot of us have in our environments, Config Manager typically happens after Ops and then before VMM. The last pieces here are VMM itself and then App Controller. These two will generally be last. And there are some special requirements, particularly for VMM, that mandate why it needs to occur last. So you can do the two of them at the same time. There's a dependency between App Controller and VMM, so they kind of have to both be up at SP1 for them to work. But for VMM and for, most specifically for VMM, VMM in SP1 has to be installed on Windows Server 2012. Yeah. So of all of these components, the entire set of these, the only one that has this specific requirement is VMM. So you're going to have a server upgrade involved, or you're going to be building yourself a new server. I will tell you that the process to upgrade VMM requires first an uninstallation of the VMM bits, and then a reinstallation of the replacement bits or the upgraded bits after the uninstallation occurs. That uninstallation, you actually will have the ability to preserve the VMM database. So you're not going to lose your data. You'll just need to reattach to that database after you go through the reinstallation. Also, VMM requires a new piece, which is the Windows ADK, which is the new name for what we used to think of as the WAKE, or the Windows Automated Installation Toolkit. So you'll need to download and install the Windows ADK. You're going to need the WinPE stuff. You're going to need the deployment stuff for it, because that's required to update what you used to have with the Windows AIK. So some interesting little bits there. Let's see, a couple of other interesting notes about that. Before you set up VMM on your upgraded server or your new server, you're going to have to run through the quick config for WinRM. So that WinRM quick config command, which will enable WinRM, which will set it to listen on the appropriate ports, which will open up whatever firewall exclusions are necessary for WinRM to work. You'll need to run that on your server after it's been upgraded to Server 2012. Also, also SQL Server Express is no longer supported for the VMM database. Okay, so no more SSX in Service Pack 1. That's going to be important, particularly if you had SSX in your old database. That can create a bit of a problem there. And then the last piece is just simply that you are going to need to upgrade the VMM agents. So on all of the machines that you've deployed VMM to, after you go through the entirety of the VMM installation and upgrade, well, then you just go to each one of those hosts and update that VMM agent. Now, what do you get right out of SP1? All kinds of new fun things. There's a new model for VM networking that adds another layer of abstraction. There's some network virtualization technologies that get added. Those technologies fantastic if you're in a multi-tenant scenario. For those of us that aren't, there are some benefits there also to performance, also to management. There's even a few security benefits there in the VM networking that can improve your posture whenever you're being attacked. We have new support for our new VHDX the file format for our virtual disks. This is great. Storage live migration in addition to regular live migration. We have the new support for SMB version 3, which are these file shares. More visibility for Ops Manager, better clustering options that are baked into the console. Just a whole bunch of really nice things that are really baked into VMM SP1. And so you are really going to appreciate the changes whenever you see them. Here I have is our server, SCVMM. Now you should notice something about this server is that it is a Windows Server 2012 instance and not the old Windows Server 2008 R2 instance that we worked with originally. I've already gone through the process of going to Control Panel and going to Programs and removing the VMM components and then adding the new VMM components over the top. I've already reconnected up to the database. This is literally a click, 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 and you're done sort of process. As far as upgrading it to Windows Server 2012, we just literally drop the DVD in, click the upgrade button, and installed Windows Server 2012 right over the top of Server 2008. You may not necessarily do this in production, but it works, and it is remarkably simple in the way that you can go about just getting the bits upgraded to SP1. So with that actually upgraded, what we have now is our copy of VMM. That copy of VMM is now in Service Pack 1. And you should notice that for the most part, most of our items here look relatively similar to what they did before. In addition to clouds now, we have tenants. And our tenants, if I'm in a multi-tenant environment where I'm delivering services to other people who are paying me for it, this is going to become very much more important. I've got the abilities to set up some VM networks here too. In my Fabric view, I now have some additional networking functions like switch extension managers and logical switches, and native port profiles and port classifications. Also gateways. These 5 consolidate to create the new networking model, the optionally new networking model that you can implement in your VMM 2012 SP1 environment. So when I'm hooked up to Server 2012 HyperV hosts, I can make use of the built-in virtual switches that are now available on Hyper-V, on the Hyper-V host. A lot of this content is stuff that you're going to hear a lot more about when we move over to the 7246 exam. So I'm not going to spend much time here, just simply because I don't want to get you confused about what you already know in terms of networking and what you're going to need to know as you sort of move into even more automations and making services available to people that may even be outside of your organization. Also down here at the bottom is just, I want to spend just a second here talking about this new file server storage that's available in SP1. With Windows Server 2012, we have this new, I guess, these improvements to the SMB protocol that increase the version number from SMB 2 to SMB 3.0. And SMB 3.0, there are some remarkable investments that Microsoft has put into SMB 3.0. With SMB 3.0, you can essentially create these scale-out file server clusters that sitting just in front of your SAN, these file servers can sit and essentially create a very highly available circumstance or a very highly available head for your SAN that allows you to then connect up Hyper-V hosts to one or even more than one of these at the same time for the purposes of fault tolerance, not even just high availability, but actual fault tolerance for the purposes of load balancing. The SMB protocol has really been improved here, and specifically, at least at this point in time, when it relates to connecting up Hyper-V hosts with their virtual machines. So that can improve all the things that you need to do in order to create high availability for your virtual machines, maybe in certain circumstances without even having to create a highly available failover cluster. You can, and it isn't completely an option at this point, but depending on what your needs are, if you choose to go down the route of SMB3 and you choose to create these scale-out file server clusters, you can do so. And again, makes things very easy because every virtual machine can be connected to through a typical standard UNC path. Greatly simplifies the process of managing those virtual machines. So this is really kind of what you're going to see whenever you complete that upgrade. The library looks relatively the same. There aren't that many changes here to the library. Our jobs view now gets a running versus a history node here, so we can see which runs have run versus which ones have run in the past. Really no new settings here in the settings screen. Not much to see. My VMs and services screen here, just again, not terribly much to see here. So what we're getting is a bit more of functionality here in the fabric, better storage connections, better networking connections, and the ability to host these Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V hosts. So what I've done actually is I've created a Hyper-V 4 machine here, which is a Windows Server 2012 server. This server has actually had the VMM agent installed onto it, and as you can see, we've got a couple of additional features here, and there are a couple of additional items that exist in this list. I can still take a look at the status here. We've got a bit of a network problem here on the machine. I can still take a look at the hardware here. I've got some storage attached to it, but I can take a look at the logical networks that have been plugged into all of these Ethernet adapters that have been plugged into it. I have got the same host access stuff, the same VM paths. I can look at reserves and storage. I can now identify logical switches, which are a new VMM construct that will connect up to my virtual switches and which specific uplinks that I have associated with those logical switches. But for the most part, it really, as you can see, everything here kind of looks pretty much the same as what we had back in the old version. And this is a really good thing. Because it allows us to go about managing everything in much the same way that we managed things before. What I do, however, want to show you are the steps that you would go through in adding an additional Hyper-V host into this environment. Now, I've created, in addition to Hyper-V 4, I have created another server here called Hyper-V 5. And so this is Hyper-V 5. It is connected up to company.pri. I have my 3 Ethernet connections that I've attached into this. I've turned on the firewall in the appropriate way, or in fact turned it off in this case. Turned on remote management, turned off the IESC. Pretty much configured this server in the same way that I configured that Windows Server 2008 R2 server that was Hyper-V 1, 2, and 3. So we have a couple of things that we have to do. This server is essentially just straight out of the box. Okay, I've plugged it into the domain. Well, one of the first things that we're going to want to do is actually connect up this server to our iSCSI target that we've set up on our server storage. So if I click yes here to start the iSCSI service, this new wizard screen that we use for the iSCSI initiator over here on the server side, as you can see, looks remarkably similar to what we were doing or what we were working with back in Server 2008 R2. In this case, let me go to Discovery here and actually discover the portal for that storage server, which I believe is 192.168.3.110. And if I choose Advanced here and set up things appropriately for the 3net and click OK, I should connect up here to our server storage.company.pri. Now on that server are going to be the variety of targets that we've created up to this point. My Quorum drive, a couple of DPM drives that we created for one of those last nuggets, my high-speed and my low-speed VM1 LUN that was created. And I've created this new LUN here called WS 2012. Let's go ahead and connect to this LUN. This process also relatively unchanged from before. I'm going to enable multipath here. In a second, I'm going to actually install the MPIO feature. Set up the default local adapter here, the correct initiator IP, and then the target portal IP for my server over on storage.company.pri. So that should connect up to the LUN here. If I verify that everything's good here under favorite targets, indeed it is. And if I auto configure the volume list, well, there we go. I actually now have a connection to this volume. Okay, the volume's actually been connected to over on the server Hyper-V 4 as well. So I now have 2 servers that are connected up and could potentially have clustering incorporated between those 2 servers because they both have access to the same LUN. Once I've made that connection, then the next thing I need to do is actually add the Hyper-V role and also the MPIO feature. If you recall back long time ago, back in nugget number 3, I believe, we talked about the things that were necessary to be installed on a Hyper-V host so that VMM could manage it. And we talked that in addition to the Hyper-V role, there was also the MPIO feature that it was just a really good idea to have that already exposed and provisioned on each host before we attempt to get to it from VMM, because of the way that VMM manages storage. Here in the Roles and Features wizard, what I want to do is make sure that I've selected Hyper-V 5. And then I want to choose the Hyper-V role here. And once the role is selected under Features, what we're looking for at this point is the Multipath I/O feature. Down here under Hyper-V, I can identify what I want my virtual switches, where I want to create that virtual switch, same setting as was before. In this case, I just happen to know that Ethernet number 2 is the correct one for that virtual switch because that's the one that's on our 1 net. Choose Next. Do I want actually to allow this server to send and receive migrations of virtual machines? Now here is what is probably the only big difference in the installation process between Server 2008 R2 and Server 2012. So one of the big features in Server 2012 is the ability to do live migrations without necessarily needing a cluster. So in 08 R2, it was the cluster that sort of handled all the live migrations. Well, Hyper-V in 2012 can now do live migrations without even needing that cluster to be there. What you get with this is the ability to do live migrations between just two individual Hyper-V hosts without a cluster being present. In order to accomplish that, however, you would need to either be logged on to the source server, physically logged onto the source server, or you can set up what is called Kerberos constrained delegation, which is a process that is very similar to the constrained delegation we set up before back in that previous nugget, so that the different hosts in this environment have already the authentication that they need to support live migration. Now, what's important to recognize here is that if this server is going to be part of a cluster, which in all likelihood you are going to do, don't actually enable migration now, because you can set these settings a little later on, and also the cluster can manage these settings for you. So we'll just set this to its default setting of not allowing for live migrations, just for now, because our cluster later on will support that. What are my default stores going to be? These are just the same defaults as what they were before, back on the program data location and then in the user's public location for the VHDs. Finally, Next, and then Install, and I'll choose to restart the destination server as part of the installation. And this will begin the process of installing Hyper-V and getting that MPIO role service installed as well onto this computer. So that process can take a minute or two, a couple of reboots as well. I'm going to pause things for just a minute, and when we come back, we'll take a look at the last step in this process, which is just adding the Hyper-V server into VMM. And we're back. So our Hyper-V host has rebooted a couple of times, and then we've actually logged back into this Hyper-V host so that we can complete the installation. We'll note the installation is complete whenever the Add Roles and Features wizard pops back up and says that we've actually got a successful installation here, a feature installation here on Hyper-V 5. So this process completes getting Hyper-V and MPIO onto our machine. The last step here is to actually bring it into VMM. So we can accomplish that here in the fabric. Let me go up here to our host group, and let's add in that Hyper-V host resource into this host group. This is going to be a Windows Server computer in a trusted Active Directory domain. We are going to use actually a different run as account, because there's actually an interesting new, new feature in VMM 2012 SP1, that the account that one uses as one's VMM service account cannot be used as a run as account. So I've apparently committed the folly of follies by using my own account. So I've created another run as account that is an administrator to accomplish these tasks here in VMM 2012 SP1. I'm going to choose Next here and then identify what the scope is for this new machine. That'll be Hyper-V 5. Choose Next again. And after a second or two, it will show me that this new Hyper-V 5 is available for adding in here to VMM. Choose Next. I can choose the host settings just like before. I need to add it into the correct host group and then reassociate it with the VMM environment. I'm not going to change the VM placement paths here because I like the default placement paths. Next and Finish, and this will bring up my little jobs view here, which is probably easier to see if I take a look at the running jobs. There's our add virtual machine host job. And I'm going to pause things one more time while we wait for the couple of minutes for this virtual machine host addition process to complete. And we're back. As you can see here, the job is completed. There's actually some information that was popped up with the completion of the job. And that's just a notice here that a reboot is going to be required to complete claiming the multipath I/O devices on that host Hyper-V 5. So after actually bringing it into VMM, we've got to go through the extra step of rebooting it one more time, and so that MPIO can go about the process of claiming all of those devices. Once this machine has been brought into VMM and the reboot is complete, we should see that machine down here just with our other server, Hyper-V 4, and we now have two machines here that exist in this host group. Everything that we have done, all of the automations we've laid into place, all of the building blocks that we would deploy can be just simply used against these hosts if they're supported in Server 2012 so that we can continue operating just like we were before. We're going to create virtual machines just like we did before. We're going to interact with those virtual machines and the different profiles and the different applications that we would install onto those virtual machines. We can even at this point create a cluster of these two hosts if we want, using what is essentially the same process that we went through to create the cluster back a number of nuggets ago on our Server 2008 R2 computers. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've really talked about the fact that, once again, working with Hyper-V, whether it be version 2 in Server 2008 R2 or version 3 in Server 2012, it's really kind of an appliance operating system. You know, it just sort of runs and you really don't have to think about it really all that much. And in many ways, Microsoft is kind of trying to take Hyper-V and make it as much like almost like VMware has made ESXi, in that you really just don't touch it all that much whenever you've got all of these System Center components into place. We talked about how SP1 adds a whole bunch of new functionality to System Center 2012, and how really, if you're going to deploy out a solution, if you haven't yet deployed one, it's worth it to maybe wait a little bit to get SP1, because there are quite a bit of bug fixes and quite a bit of feature improvements that happen with SP1. Two of the big ones are the support for Windows Server 2012 and Windows 8, and also what we'll talk about next, which is that support for Windows Azure, as well as a whole bunch more. If you do end up going about with upgrading your production environment, there is a specific order of upgrade that starts with Orchestrator and continues all the way through at the very end with SCVMM, and then updating those VMM agents on your different hosts. And then down in the interaction portion, we actually added the Hyper-V role and MPIO feature to one of the machines, and then worked with that instance here inside VMM. Coming up next is the last and final nugget in this series. And 20 nuggets later, we've got SP1 into our environment, and we're finally going to see what can happen when we take our existing private cloud environment and hook it up into the Windows Azure public cloud environment. I think you're going to be really excited about how you can make that connection, how you can leverage some of the resources that you've already created here in VMM to make use of in your Azure public cloud environment. That's the topic for our next nugget. But until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.